Mara Holloway never thought her life would split so cleanly into a before and an after. But the day her father raised his hand against her daughter, everything she believed about family cracked open like a fragile mirror. Before that moment, Mara had spent years pretending that the coldness in her childhood home was just a personality flaw, not something sharper and more dangerous. Her father, Lionel Holloway, was known in their town as a stern man with a perfect lawn and a perfect smile, but behind closed doors, he carried his pride like a weapon. On a rainy afternoon, 9-year-old Ivy sat at the dining table, her legs swinging nervously as she whispered to her mother, "Mama, did I do something wrong?" Mara shook her head quickly, brushing Ivy's curls back.
"No, sweetheart.
"You're perfect just the way you are." Lionel, standing in the doorway, scoffed softly. "Perfect," he muttered, his voice low but heavy. "Nothing about this situation is perfect." Mara turned, her heart pounding. "What do you mean by that, Dad?" Lionel's eyes hardened, and he stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the floor like a warning. "You brought a child into this family who doesn't belong," he said. Ivy shrank back, confused, clutching her chair. The room felt too small, too tight, like the walls were leaning in to listen. Mara's voice trembled as she said, "She belongs with me. That should be enough." Lionel laughed once, sharply. "You always were naive, Mara." The sound of rain against the window grew louder, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The moment Lionel's hand struck the table instead of Ivy's face was still enough to send a jolt of terror through the room, and Ivy burst into tears, burying her face in Mara's side. Mara wrapped her arms around her daughter, her own body shaking, her mind racing faster than she could control. "Don't you ever scare my child like that again," Mara said, her voice louder than she expected. Lionel straightened, offended. "I am your father," he snapped. "You don't speak to me that way." Mara stared at him, seeing not the man who taught her to ride a bike or helped with her school projects, but someone else entirely, someone who measured love in terms of bloodlines and obedience. "You don't get to claim respect when you can't even show kindness," she replied. Lionel turned away, muttering something about mistakes and disappointments. That night, as Mara tucked Ivy into bed, Ivy sniffed and whispered, "Grandpa doesn't like me, does he?" Mara forced a smile, pressing a kiss to Ivy's forehead. "Some people don't know how to show love properly," she said gently. But inside, a plan was forming, slow and steady like a rising tide. She thought about the family business Lionel guarded like a throne, the inheritance he spoke of like a crown to be passed down only to those he deemed worthy. As Ivy drifted to sleep, Mara sat in the dim light of the hallway, staring at her hands, and whispered to herself, "I will make a place for you in this world, even if I have to build it from the ground up." The next morning, Mara called her younger brother, Caleb, who had always kept his distance from Lionel's harsh ways. "Caleb," she said as soon as he answered, "I need to talk to you. It's about Dad." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That doesn't sound good," Caleb replied. They met at a small cafe by the river, where the smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air, trying to soften the tension between them. Mara told him everything, her words spilling out in a rush. Caleb listened, his jaw tightening. "He hasn't changed, has he?" he said quietly. Mara shook her head.
"No."
"And I'm done pretending he will." Caleb leaned back, crossing his arms. "So, what are you thinking?" Mara looked out the window at the slow-moving water. "I'm thinking about the family company," she said. "About the shares Dad keeps in his safe. About the future he thinks he controls." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about taking his power away." Mara met his gaze. "I'm talking about protecting my daughter." Caleb sighed, then nodded. "If you're going to do this, you won't be alone." Back at home, Ivy colored at the kitchen table, humming softly. "Mama, what are you drawing?" Ivy asked. Mara smiled faintly. "A better tomorrow," she said. Ivy grinned, holding up her own picture. "Mine has a castle and a dragon," she said proudly. Mara laughed, a real laugh this time. "Every good story needs a dragon," she replied, thinking of Lionel and the battle she knew was coming. Mara began visiting the company offices under the excuse of learning the ropes, and Lionel, pleased by what he saw as sudden interest, welcomed her with a thin smile. "Finally taking responsibility," he said one afternoon. Mara kept her face neutral. "I just want to understand the family legacy," she replied. She spent hours talking with employees, listening to their complaints and hopes, earning their trust one conversation at a time. One older accountant, Mrs. Doyle, leaned in one day and whispered, "Your father doesn't listen to anyone anymore." Mara nodded. Maybe it's time someone did. At home, Ivy noticed the change. "You're gone a lot, Mama," she said, her small voice tinged with worry. Mara knelt beside her. "I'm working on something important," she said. "Something for us." Ivy thought for a moment, then said, "Can I help?" Mara smiled, brushing Ivy's hair back. "You already are, just by being you." Lionel, meanwhile, began to sense a shift. "You're getting too involved," he warned her one evening over dinner. Mara took a sip of water, calm. "Isn't that what you wanted?" she asked. Lionel frowned, unsettled by her steady gaze. "Just remember who built all this," he said. Mara set her glass down. "And remember who it's meant to serve," she replied. The air between them felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. That night, Mara wrote notes in a small notebook, mapping out allies, legal paths, and quiet moves. She wasn't acting out of revenge, she told herself, but out of love, a love that demanded space, safety, and a future for Ivy that no one could take away. The day of the family meeting arrived like a heavy cloud on the horizon. Lionel sat at the head of the long table, his hands folded, his expression confident. Mara and Caleb took their seats across from him, Ivy waiting in the hallway with Mrs. Doyle, coloring quietly. "Let's get this over with," Lionel said. Mara took a deep breath. "Actually, Dad, we need to talk about the company's future." Lionel smirked. "My future?" Mara shook her head. "Our future." Caleb slid a folder across the table. "These are the new partnership agreements," he said. Lionel opened it, his smile fading as he read. "You went behind my back," he growled. Mara leaned forward, her voice steady. "I went in front of my daughter," she said. "And I will always choose her." Lionel stood up abruptly. "You think this gives you power?" he shouted. Mara stood too. "No," she said softly. "It gives her a place." The door opened, and Ivy peeked in. "Mama," she called. Mara turned, her face softening instantly. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said. "Come here." Ivy walked in, holding her drawing of the castle and dragon. She handed it to Lionel shyly. "This is for you," she said. Lionel looked down at the paper, his anger faltering, just for a moment. The room fell silent. Mara placed a hand on Ivy's shoulder and thought, not of victory, but of peace. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. The story of her family would no longer be written by fear, but by the quiet, stubborn courage of love. Lionel stared at Ivy's drawing longer than anyone expected, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the paper. The dragon, drawn in bright red crayon, loomed over a small blue castle, but in the corner, Ivy had added a tiny figure holding a yellow flag. "That's the brave one," Ivy said softly, pointing. Lionel cleared his throat and set the paper down. "Enough of this," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Mara felt a strange mix of relief and sadness as she guided Ivy back to the hallway. When the door closed, Lionel turned to Mara and Caleb. "You think you can rewrite everything I built?" he asked. Mara folded her arms. "No," she said. "I think we can make it better." Caleb added quietly, "And fair." Lionel scoffed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now, a crack in the armor. The meeting ended without a clear victory, but Mara knew something had shifted. That evening, she and Ivy sat on the couch, the castle and dragon drawing spread between them. "Mama, was Grandpa mad at me?" Ivy asked. Mara pulled her close. "He was mad at himself," she said gently. Ivy frowned. "Why?" Mara sighed. "Because sometimes people don't like who they become." Ivy thought about this, then smiled. "I like who you are," she said. Mara laughed softly, feeling the weight of the day ease just a little. Over the next few weeks, the house felt different, quieter but also lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Lionel stopped calling as often, and when he did, his tone was guarded instead of commanding. Mara, meanwhile, focused on strengthening the new partnerships Caleb had helped arrange. One afternoon, Mrs. Doyle visited Mara at home, bringing a stack of papers and a warm smile. "Your father signed the preliminary agreements," she said. Mara blinked in surprise. "He did." Mrs. Doyle nodded. "He didn't look happy about it, but he signed." Ivy peeked around the corner, curious. "Are those important papers?" she asked. Mara smiled. "They are," she said. "They're about building something new." Ivy ran off and returned with her toy blocks, stacking them carefully. "I'm building too," she announced. Mara watched her daughter, realizing how deeply Ivy had absorbed the idea of creating rather than destroying. That night, Mara dreamed of a long road stretching ahead, lined with people she trusted, walking beside her instead of behind her. When she woke, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope without fear attached to it. Lionel finally came to visit on a quiet Sunday afternoon, standing awkwardly on the porch with a small box in his hands. Mara hesitated before opening the door, then stepped aside. "Come in," she said. Ivy peeked from behind the couch, her eyes wide. Lionel knelt down, holding out the box. I brought you something," he said gruffly. Ivy took it carefully and opened it to find a set of colored pencils, neatly arranged. "They're pretty," she whispered. Lionel nodded. "I thought you might like to draw more castles." Ivy smiled shyly. "And dragons," she added. Lionel almost smiled back. Mara watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. Later, as Ivy colored at the table, Lionel turned to Mara. "I didn't know how to handle everything," he said. "That's not an excuse." Mara met his gaze. "No," she agreed. "It's not." There was a long silence, but it wasn't as sharp as before. It felt like the space after a storm, where the air is still heavy but clean. When Lionel left, he paused at the door. "I'll try," he said simply. Mara nodded. "That's all I ever wanted," she replied. Caleb called one evening, his voice excited. "The community center project got approved," he said. "The company's funding it." Mara smiled. "That's wonderful." Ivy overheard and asked, "What's a community center?" Mara explained, and Ivy's eyes lit up. "Can I go there and draw?" she asked. "You can do a lot more than draw," Mara said. The opening day was bright and warm, filled with laughter and music. Lionel stood at the back, watching as Ivy ran around with other children, her laughter ringing out like a bell. He leaned toward Mara. "She's happy," he said, almost surprised. Mara nodded. "She always has been," she replied. "She just needed room to be." Lionel looked thoughtful, his hands clasped in front of him. "Maybe we all do," he said quietly. As months passed, the company changed in small but meaningful ways. Employees smiled more, meetings felt less like battles and more like conversations. Mara found herself enjoying the work, not because it gave her control, but because it allowed her to create opportunities for others. One evening, Ivy sat beside her at the desk, doodling on scrap paper. "Mama," she said, "are you still fighting the dragon?" Mara laughed. "Not anymore," she said. "We're learning how to live with it." Ivy nodded solemnly, then grinned. "I like the castle better," she declared. Mara looked around at their small, cozy home and felt the truth in that simple statement. The castle wasn't a building or a business. It was the safety they had built together. Lionel began coming to family dinners again, quieter than before, more observant. He listened when Ivy talked about school, about her friends, about the pictures she drew. One night, Ivy asked him, "Do you like my mom?" The question hung in the air. Lionel cleared his throat. "I'm learning too," he said honestly. Mara raised an eyebrow, but Ivy just laughed. "You're funny, Grandpa," she said. Mara realized that healing didn't always come with grand apologies or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it came in small, awkward steps forward, in questions asked and answered without anger. Caleb eventually moved closer, bringing his own family into the fold. The house filled with noise and warmth, with shared meals and late-night conversations. Mara found herself telling stories from her childhood, not just the painful ones, but the good ones too. Ivy listened wide-eyed. "You were little too?" she asked in disbelief. Mara laughed. "Once," she said. Lionel listened as well, a faint smile on his face, as if remembering a version of himself he had almost forgotten. One evening, Ivy handed Mara a new drawing. It showed a castle, a dragon, and a group of people standing together, holding hands. "This is us," Ivy said proudly. Mara felt tears prick her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Lionel leaned over to look. "Where am I?" he asked. Ivy pointed to a figure near the dragon. "You're helping him be nice," she said. Lionel chuckled, a deep, genuine sound. "I guess I am," he said. Mara realized then that her plan had never really been about taking something away from her father. It had been about giving something to her daughter, a sense of belonging, a future that wasn't shaped by fear or rejection. As she watched Ivy run through the yard, laughing with Caleb's children, she felt a deep, steady peace settle in her chest. The past still existed, but it no longer ruled them. Years later, on a quiet evening, Mara and Ivy sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft gold and pink. Ivy, now taller and more confident, leaned against her mother. "Mama," she said, "do you think our story is a good one?" Mara smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I think it's a brave one," she replied. From inside, Lionel's voice called them in for dinner, warm and familiar. Mara stood, taking Ivy's hand, and stepped forward into a future that felt, at last, like home. The next chapter of their lives began quietly, without any dramatic announcement or grand turning point, just the steady rhythm of ordinary days slowly stitching themselves into something meaningful. Mara noticed it in the mornings when Ivy packed her own school bag, humming to herself as she checked for pencils and notebooks, and in the evenings when Lionel sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper while Caleb joked about his clumsy attempts at cooking. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mara overheard Ivy asking Lionel, "Grandpa, were you ever scared when you were little?" Lionel paused, folding the paper carefully. "All the time," he admitted. Ivy's eyes widened. "Even you?" Lionel nodded. "Especially me." Mara listened from the doorway, realizing how powerful that simple honesty was. It wasn't a confession of guilt or a formal apology, but it was a bridge. Later that night, Mara sat with Lionel on the porch. "You didn't have to answer her like that," she said gently. Lionel sighed. "Maybe I did," he replied. "I spent too long pretending I was never afraid." The wind rustled the trees, and for the first time, Mara felt like they were no longer standing on opposite sides of the same story, but slowly learning how to walk forward together, even if their steps were still unsure. At the community center, Ivy had started a small art club, gathering children around a long table covered in paper, markers, and bright paints. Mara volunteered to help on weekends, watching as Ivy encouraged shy kids to draw whatever they felt, not what they thought was right. One Saturday, Lionel showed up unexpectedly, carrying a box of snacks. "I thought you might need these," he said awkwardly. Ivy beamed. "You can sit with us," she offered. Lionel hesitated, then pulled up a chair. A little boy handed him a crayon and said, "You can draw too." Lionel stared at the crayon as if it were a strange object, then slowly began sketching a crooked house with a lopsided roof. Ivy leaned over. "That's a funny house," she giggled. Lionel smiled. "It looks like mine used to feel," he said. Mara felt her throat tighten as she watched him laugh with the children, realizing how different this man was from the one who had once ruled his home with silence and control. The room buzzed with voices and color, and in that simple space, Mara saw how healing could spread outward, touching not just their family, but everyone around them. Caleb's family grew closer too, their weekends blending into shared meals, long walks, and late-night talks that stretched past midnight. One night, as they sat around a small fire in the backyard, Caleb raised a mug and said, "To messy families and second chances." Everyone laughed and clinked their cups together. Ivy leaned against Mara and whispered, "I like our family. It's loud." Mara laughed softly. "So do I," she replied. Lionel stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I didn't know families could be like this," he admitted. Mara looked at him, surprised. "Like what?" Lionel gestured around. "Warm," he said. "Not perfect, but warm." The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky like tiny stars. In that moment, Mara realized that the inheritance they had been fighting over for so long wasn't money or buildings or power. It was this connection, laughter, the courage to stay at the table even when conversations were hard. And this was something no contract could ever truly control. As Ivy grew older, she began to understand the deeper layers of their family story. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums with Mara, she found a picture of Lionel as a young man, standing stiffly beside his own father. "He looks sad," Ivy said. Mara nodded. "I think he was," she replied. Ivy thought for a moment. "Do you think he wanted to be different?" Mara smiled gently. "I think he just didn't know how." That evening, Ivy showed the photo to Lionel. He stared at it for a long time. "I forgot about this day," he said quietly. Ivy took his hand. "You look happier now," she said simply. Lionel swallowed hard and squeezed her hand back. "I am," he admitted. Mara watched them, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the strange, winding path that had brought them here. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, reshaped into something that could be understood instead of feared. On a clear spring morning, Mara stood in the doorway watching Ivy leave for school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her steps confident and light. Lionel waved from the porch, and Caleb shouted a joke that made Ivy laugh as she ran down the path. Mara felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest, the kind that comes from knowing you've done something that matters, even if no one else ever writes it down or celebrates it. When the house grew quiet again, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about how their story had changed. It hadn't ended with a victory or a defeat, but with a choice to keep showing up, to keep talking, to keep building something better out of what had once been broken. She smiled to herself, looking out at the sunlight spilling across the yard, and whispered the same promise she had made years ago in a dim hallway. "We're safe. We belong. And our story is still being written."